Your Bible calls him a servant, the man who parted the Red Sea, the man who climbed into a cloud on a mountain and came back carrying the law of God written in stone by the finger of God, the man whose name the divine repeated twice from inside a burning bush that would not stop burning. Moses, Moses, that man. Servant. And here is what the translators did not tell you. The Hebrew word underneath that translation doesn't just mean servant. It means slave. And the root verb it comes from also means to worship. Not three words wrestling for the same space. One word. One ancient unified reality. And the moment you understand what that word actually holds, you stop reading the same book you thought you had been reading for all these years. The word is avad, pronounced avad. It appears 803 times in the Hebrew Bible, which puts it among the most common nouns in the entire Old Testament. And in nearly every one of those 803 appearances, your English translation reaches for the word servant. The problem is that the English word servant does not carry what avad carries, not even close. A servant in English can quit. A servant negotiates terms. A servant keeps a portion of his identity separate from the person he serves. A servant has a life that exists outside the relationship. Avad is none of those things. Avad is not a professional arrangement. Avad is not a contract with an exit clause. Avad is a person whose entire existence, labor, loyalty, identity, future has been absorbed into another. That is not a metaphor stretched from an economic reality. That is the economic reality. And every ancient Israelite knew exactly what it meant when they heard it. The text is using this word deliberately, and it has been softened in English for 400 years. And once you hear it in the original, you cannot unhear it. Let me put you in a specific place. Not the Sunday school image, not the golden afternoon light, not the scenic marketplace of imagination. The real one. Ancient Jerusalem. Noise of a crowd that has been working since before sunrise. The smell of animals and bread and stone that has absorbed 40 summers of heat. And in one corner of that marketplace, a transaction is happening. A man is not being hired. He is not signing an employment agreement. He is being transferred. His labor, his schedule, his presence, his productivity, his time, all of it is being passed by legal contract to another party. The people watching that transaction have one word for what he just became, avad. And that word, those exact same two syllables, is what God uses when he says Moses is his own. The marketplace transaction and the burning bush calling share a word. The bought man and the chosen prophet share a title. Ancient Hebrew did not flinch at that overlap. It built its theology on it. The root verb behind avad is avad, written with the same three Hebrew letters, ayin, bet, daled. And avad is one of the most theologically important verbs in the Hebrew language because it carries three simultaneous meanings without any sense of internal contradiction. It means to work, as in physical labor, as in the labor of a field hand or a craftsman. It means to serve, as in subjecting yourself to another's authority and will. And it means to worship, as in directing your complete devotion and energy toward a deity. These are not loose metaphors layered onto a shared root by careless scribes. This is how the ancient Hebrew mind actually organized the structure of reality. Work, service, and worship were not three different human categories that happened to share a word. They were one category, viewed from three angles. The same fundamental act, giving your energy, your orientation, your entire effort to something or someone, expressed itself as labor in the field, as loyalty to a king, and as devotion to God. All the same verb, all the same three letters, all the same deep human movement. You can trace this with precision in specific texts. In Exodus 3:12, God speaks to Moses at the burning bush and says, "When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." The Hebrew word there is ta'avdun, from avad. Your English Bible translates it worship, but it is the exact same verb used when a slave labors for his master. In Exodus 25, the commandment against bowing to idols says, "You shall not serve them," lo ta'avdem. Same verb, same root, this time describing the worship of false gods. And in Genesis 2:15, when God places Adam in the garden to work it and keep it, that word work is avad. Cultivating the earth, serving a king, worshiping God. Same three letters cutting through all of it. The ancient Israelite was not confused by this convergence. He understood intuitively that directing your whole energy towards something, whether towards soil or sovereign or the divine, was always the same fundamental act. The act of the avad. The only question the text ever asks is, toward whom? That is the deep structure beneath avad. An avad of God is not an employee who keeps afternoons for himself. An avad of God is not a volunteer who shows up when it's spiritually convenient. An avad of God is someone whose labor, loyalty, and worship have all been handed over in one piece, at one moment, without division. That is not a comfortable description. That is a demanding one. And it is the precise description the Hebrew text reaches for when it wants to say something ultimate and irreversible about a human being's relationship with the divine. divine. Now let's look at who actually receives this title in the Hebrew Bible, because the list is going to rearrange some of the categories you carry. Moses, yes, we'll come back to him at length, but Abraham is called Avad in Genesis 26:24, where God says to Isaac, "I am the God of Abraham your father. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake." Abraham, Avad. Joshua is called Avad at his death in Joshua 24:29. David is called Avad repeatedly in the Psalms. The superscriptions of Psalms 18 and 36 both open with David the servant, the Avad of the Lord. Job is called Avad in Job 1:8, when God introduces him directly to the adversary. "Have you considered my servant Job?" And then there is the one that should stop you entirely. Jeremiah 25:9 calls Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king who burned Jerusalem and shattered the temple and exiled an entire nation, my servant Nebuchadnezzar. The conqueror of Israel is given the same title as Moses. The Jewish Encyclopedia confirms this directly. Avad Yahweh, servant of God, was a title of honor applied across the full range of ancient Israelite experience, from patriarchs to prophets to foreign kings who did not worship Israel's God. This word is not describing a job. It is naming a relationship of total orientation, of having turned entirely toward something, of there being no remainder of self pointing in another direction. Moses holds this title more completely than anyone else in the Old Testament. He is called Avad Yahweh more times in the text than any other individual. And in Deuteronomy 34:5, in what are essentially the final words written about him by the narrative, the text says, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord." Not Moses the prophet, not Moses the lawgiver, not Moses the miracle worker, Moses the Avad. His final designation, the one that stands over his death as his defining characteristic, is the one who gave himself entirely. Orthodox Judaism preserves this to this day. Moses is called Moshe Rabbeinu, Eved Hashem, our teacher Moses, servant of God. That is his highest title. Not his power, not his revelation, not his miracles. His total self-giving. I want you to sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is easy to let it pass too quickly. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace. He was educated in the most sophisticated court in the ancient world. He had access to power that would have made every other Hebrew in Egypt stare in silence. He had options. He had a future that looked nothing like a burning desert and a reluctant commission. And then one afternoon, a bush catches fire and refuses to stop burning. And a voice from inside the fire says, "Go back. Go back to the city you fled. Go back to the man who wanted you dead. Go back and tell the most powerful figure on earth to release his entire workforce, without compensation, on the authority of a God that Pharaoh does not recognize." And Moses goes. And 40 years later, standing on a mountain overlooking a land he will never be allowed to enter, the narrative gives him one word for what he was: Eved, the one who accepted the total claim, the one at another's entire disposal. Consider what it would mean for the text to have used a different word. In Deuteronomy 34, the narrative could have called Moses a prophet, Navi in Hebrew. It could have called him a leader, a man of God, a judge. All of those titles existed in the Hebrew vocabulary. All of them would have been accurate. And the text sets them aside and reaches for Eved, because the other titles describe what Moses did. Eved describes what Moses was. A prophet speaks for God, and Eved belongs to God. Those are not the same thing. Speaking for someone is a function. Belonging to someone is an identity. And the Hebrew text is insisting, in its choice of this one word over every other available word, that what defined Moses was not his function, but his orientation. He was pointed entirely toward the Lord. There was no part of him that was not. That is what the text wants you to carry away from his life. There is also something in the Hebrew grammar of Eved worth noticing. When the text calls Moses Eved YHWH, Eved of the Lord, it is using a construct form. In Hebrew grammar, the construct chain is how you express a relationship of belonging or specification. Eved YHWH means, precisely, the Eved who belongs to YHWH. The word does not modify Moses like an adjective. It defines him in relation to someone else. His identity in the text is always relational. Moses is not his own reference point. He is defined by who he belongs to, and the text announces this as his highest honor. Not a limitation on Moses, an honor given to him. Now this is the moment where this channel has to do the thing that separates it from the videos that only give you the beautiful half of a word. Because Eved has a difficult half, and it is not optional. The word genuinely includes the concept of slavery as the ancient world practiced it. Coerced, legal, purchased bondage. This is not a marginal use. The same Eved that describes Moses also appears in Exodus 21:2, inside the specific legal code governing the treatment and release of Hebrew slaves. The same same word describes the Israelites' condition in Egypt. Beit avadim, house of evads, house of slaves, is the phrase Deuteronomy reaches for 6 times to describe what Egypt was. The Exodus narrative does not use evad as metaphor when it speaks of bondage. It uses it as a description of people whose labor and freedom have been taken by force. Real bondage, real chains, real unpaid labor under compulsion. That is part of the semantic world of this word. What responsible scholars of the Hebrew Bible describe is that avad operated on a spectrum. At one end, coerced, involuntary servitude with no exit and no self-determination. At the other end, the voluntary, complete devotion of a worshiper who has chosen to give everything without reservation and without regret. But here is the crucial point. It was always one spectrum, never 2 separate words. The Hebrew mind did not create a separate, spiritually sanitized vocabulary for the divine relationship. It used the same word that the marketplace used. And scholars suggest this was not an accident or a failure of vocabulary. The full weight of the economic reality was precisely what gave the theological title its force. When God calls Moses his avad, every Israelite who heard that word would feel the full gravity of what is being said. This man has been transferred. There is no negotiating the terms back. There is no part of him that remains outside God's claim. That is what the word means. And the translators who reached for servant were reaching for a word with soft edges. Eved has no soft edges. There is also something important about the direction of obligation in the word eved that the translation servant almost entirely hides from you. When we say servant in English, we typically imagine the obligation running one direction, from the servant toward the master. The servant owes something. The servant is the one with the duty. But in the ancient Hebrew context, eved was a relational category that carried obligations in both directions. A master who had an eved was responsible for that eved, responsible for their sustenance, their protection, their welfare. The Lord who acquired an eved had not merely gained a worker, he had acquired a responsibility. And this is not incidental background. It is the theological weight underneath Psalm 34:22, where the Lord is described as redeeming the lives of his eveds, buying them out of the bondage that threatens them. An eved of the Lord is not simply someone who works for God. An eved of the Lord is someone under God's specific protection and obligation. The direction of the claim runs both ways, and servant in English loses the return direction entirely. Now I want to bring you into the most debated cluster of texts in the entire Old Testament, the servant songs of Isaiah. 4 poems in chapters 40 through 55, all orbiting the same mysterious figure called Eved YHWH. The first song opens at Isaiah 42:1. Behold my servant, Avdi, my Eved, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. Hear the context into which Isaiah's original audience receives this word. They are in Babylon. Jerusalem has been broken. The temple that was supposed to be indestructible is ash and rubble. And God announces, here is my Eved. And this Eved does not look like rescue from the outside. He does not shout in the streets. He does not break bruised reeds or extinguish dimly burning wicks. He is not a military savior. He brings justice through fidelity alone. He is the Eved who keeps going precisely when there is no visible reason to keep going. Jewish tradition has historically read this figure as Israel collectively, the Eved as the people called to be a light to the nations, even while they sit in their own darkness and ash. Christian tradition reads it as the Messiah. Both traditions, without exception, reach for the same word, Eved, the total one, the one who gave all. And God's soul, the text says, God's very nephesh, his own being, delights in this person. The word Eved is also embedded in human names throughout the ancient Semitic world in a way that tells you precisely how the ancients valued this concept. The prophet Obadiah, in Hebrew, Ovadiah, his name means Eved of Yah, servant worshipper of the Lord. His name is a theological identity statement inscribed at birth, and the pattern stretches across the entire ancient Near East. In Arabic, Abdullah means slave of God, and has been one of the most common names in the world for 14 centuries. In ancient Aramaic inscriptions, in Phoenician texts, in the epigraphic records of civilizations neighboring Israel, the same root avad appears as an element in names given to honor a deity. The Jewish Encyclopedia notes that devoted worshippers of the deity were commonly designated as God's servants across all the Semitic dialects, expressed in names that combine the servanthood root with the name of the god. Across the ancient world, the highest thing you could say about a human being's relationship to the divine was, this person is an Eved. Because in the ancient world, proximity to a powerful lord was elevation by association. An Eved of the king of Egypt was royalty by proximity. An Eved of the creator of the universe was something the ancient mind had no adequate category for except total, complete, given entirely. Psalm 34:22 in the Hebrew places one more anchor before we arrive at the personal question this word always builds toward. The Lord redeems the life of his servants, avad, his aveds, his slave worshippers. And the verb is redeems, a verb with a specific economic meaning in the ancient world, to buy someone out of bondage, to pay the price that frees a person who cannot free themselves. The structure of this verse is doing something precise. The people who belong entirely to God are the people he acts to ransom. The binding goes both ways. You are his aved, and he behaves like an owner who has staked his own reputation on the life of the one he owns. This is not the relationship of an employer to a replaceable worker. It is the relationship of a lord to someone whose life he has declared his own responsibility. When you hear the Psalms singing about God as Redeemer, you are hearing the Aved word field sing back. The one who claims you entirely is the one obligated by the nature of that claim to fight for you. Now the most read verse in the Hebrew Bible, Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And the verse immediately following, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. Then in Deuteronomy 6:13, 3 verses later, it is the Lord your God you shall fear, him you shall serve. The Hebrew, avad, the same root as eved. The Shema and its surrounding context are not moving from love to a different category called service. They are describing the same movement at increasing depth. Love at its fullest, in the Hebrew framework, does not stop at sentiment. It arrives at eved. It arrives at the person whose work and worship have become the same act because they understand, at a level beneath argument, that they always were. And here is the honest turn the channel always takes, because this is what separates a real word study from one that just gives you the beautiful parts. When scholars look at the Eved literature, a question they have long wrestled with is this. When the text calls someone Eved of God, is it describing a posture they chose or one they were assigned? For Moses, the account in Exodus suggests both at once. Moses didn't volunteer for the burning bush. He was walking by. He turned to look. He didn't generate the call found him. And yet his response was a choice. He tried to refuse, actually, offering objection after objection, but eventually he goes. Eventually he accepts the Eved identity. And from that moment, the text treats his life as the life of an Eved, not because he was forced, but because he said yes. The voluntary Eved and the assigned Eved arrive at the same place. Total orientation. The path was different. The destination was the same. This matters because it means Eved is not primarily about the origin of the call. It is about the response to it. Whether you were drafted into this relationship or walked into it with your eyes open, what the text measures is whether, after the call came, you said yes with everything you had. That is the thing that names you Eved, not the circumstances, the quality of the yes. There is one more moment in the biblical narrative that brings Eved full circle in a way no English translation captures. In Joshua 1, immediately after Moses dies, immediately after the text has just called him Eved YHWH for the last time, God speaks to Joshua. And Joshua 1:2 begins, Moses my servant, Avdi, my Eved, is dead. Not the prophet is dead. Not the leader is dead. My Eved is dead. And then God turns immediately to Joshua. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan. The Eved has died. The work continues. The implication is unmistakable. What made Moses irreplaceable was not his unique skill set. It was his relationship. The avad, the total service worship, is what Joshua is now being called to continue. Not to be Moses, not to replicate the miracles, to continue the posture, to remain an Eved. The word travels forward through the narrative even as the person who held it dies. And that is the most complete thing the Hebrew Bible ever says about Eved. It is not attached to an individual's uniqueness. It is a posture that any person can take up. And the text is always looking to see whether the next generation will. And think about what that means for you specifically. Not Moses, not Joshua, not the reader in ancient Israel who knew what Eved meant in their bones because they lived in a world where the word was everywhere. You. Living in a century that has made the language of total allegiance unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. A century that has built its entire social vocabulary around concepts like autonomy and self-determination and personal brand. Eved cuts straight across all of that. It doesn't argue with those concepts, it simply names a different orientation. One where the question, what do I want, has been replaced by, what does the one I belong to require? That replacement is not oppression in the text's framework. That replacement is worship. That replacement is what it looks like in concrete daily life to be an Eved. Not in dramatic historical moments on mountainsides, in the ordinary ones. Is there a gap right now between how you would describe your relationship with God and what avad would describe? Not a failure gap, a distance gap. A gap between what you believe in theory and what your time, your energy, your attention actually demonstrate about where your orientation lies. That gap has a name in the Hebrew text. It is the distance between a hired hand and an avad. And the entire arc of the Hebrew Bible is the story, told over and over in different lives and different centuries, of people who closed that distance. Moses closed it at a burning bush. The servant of Isaiah 42 closes it in a way that costs him everything. And the text says, in both cases, that the one who calls them avad considers this the defining thing about them. For those leading Bible studies, teaching in churches, raising children in faith, trying to hand something true and structurally honest down to the next generation, this word is worth your time. Because if you teach Moses without avad, you have taught someone about a man who had a remarkable career working for God. Avad says something different. Avad says Moses was the kind of person whose identity and his God had become inseparable. His final title, the one that stands over his death, was not his accomplishments or his office. It was his relationship, the total one, the one with no remainder. That is what your English word servant has been quietly removing from you. It keeps the role. It loses the bond. It keeps the job description. It loses the claim that runs both ways, the one where you give all, and the one where the Lord who claimed you is obligated by the very structure of this relationship to redeem. If this word rearranged something for you, if hearing avad instead of servant puts pressure on something you thought you understood, leave a comment below and tell me which part landed differently than you expected. This channel is for people who already believe something and are hungry to understand it with more precision, not to create doubt, to deepen what is already there. Subscribe if you haven't, because the next word we're going into is the Hebrew kavod, which your English Bible almost always translates as glory. But kavod's literal root meaning is not radiance. It is not light. It means heavy, weight, physical mass. The word the prophets used for the overwhelming, undeniable presence of God was borrowed from the word for something simply too heavy to lift. And when you understand that, when you hear Isaiah saying, "The whole earth is full of his glory," and realize that Isaiah wasn't describing a glow, but something closer to pressure, to weight that fills a room and presses down on everything in it, you will not read those passages the same way again. You have been reading a translation of a translation, and now you know one more word they softened on the way.